Some places are abandoned for a reason. Others are abandoned because the truth inside them was never meant to be found. The old cave house sat alone against the cliffs outside Black Hollow, Montana, where the pine trees bent under the cold wind and the mountains swallowed sound like a grave. The locals called it the Stone Nest. Nobody drove near it after dark. Nobody hiked the ridge above it anymore. And nobody understood why a man would spend his final $400 on a crumbling cave carved into rock 70 years ago. But Ethan Walker did. Or at least he thought he did. The rusted county auction sign still leaned crooked beside the dirt road as Ethan's battered Ford pickup crawled through the mud toward the property line. Rainwater streaked across the windshield. Beside him sat Atlas, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a broad chest, sable fur dark as wet cedar bark, and amber eyes that never stopped watching the world. Atlas had once worked narcotics alongside Ethan during his years as a K-9 officer in Spokane. Now the dog simply watched over a man trying not to fall apart. Ethan tightened his hands around the steering wheel. His knuckles looked rougher lately. Older. The past year had hollowed him out in quiet ways. Suspension from the department. False accusations nobody bothered correcting. Savings gone. Apartment gone. Friends slowly disappearing like lights shutting off one window at a time. At 38 years old, Ethan Walker owned exactly 3 things that still mattered. The truck, the dog, and the folded photograph inside his jacket pocket of his younger sister Lily, smiling beside a lake before cancer carried her away 3 winters earlier. The road narrowed sharply near the cliffs. Fog drifted low across the mountain pass, wrapping around the headlights in pale silver ribbons. The scent of rain, pine sap, and cold stone filled the truck cab each time the wind pushed through the cracked window. Atlas suddenly lifted his head, ears forward. Still. Ethan glanced sideways. You feel it too, huh? The cave house finally appeared through the mist. It looked less like a home and more like part of the mountain itself. Jagged stone walls disappeared into the cliffside, while a sagging wooden porch leaned toward the ravine below as though exhausted by time. Half the windows were boarded shut. Moss crept along the roofline. One section of the chimney had collapsed years ago, scattering blackened stones into the weeds. The entire place carried the silence of something forgotten by God. Ethan killed the engine. The mountain became quiet instantly. Too quiet. No highway noise. No birds. Only the distant creak of pine branches rubbing together somewhere high above the ridge. Atlas climbed out first, boots crunching over gravel as Ethan followed with an old duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The cold hit harder outside, sharp and damp against his skin. Atlas stood near the porch steps, staring at the house without moving. His tail stayed low. Not fearful. Focused. Yeah, Ethan muttered softly. Not exactly the Ritz. The porch groaned under their weight. Dust coated the windows from inside. One nail scratched slowly against loose wood somewhere beneath the floorboards as the wind shifted. Ethan pushed open the front door with his shoulder. A stale breath of earth and old smoke rolled out from the darkness. The beam from his flashlight cut across cracked stone walls, rusted lantern hooks, and furniture buried beneath white sheets that looked almost ghost-like in the gloom. Water dripped steadily somewhere deeper inside the cave house. Tick, tick, tick. Atlas stepped forward slowly, then stopped. His ears twitched. His body stiffened near the back wall beside the ancient fireplace carved directly into the stone. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Atlas. The German shepherd lowered his head toward the rock wall. A deep growl rumbled quietly inside his chest. Not aggression. Recognition. Then, without warning, Atlas lifted one paw and scratched hard against the stone. Once. Twice. 3 times. Somewhere behind that wall, something hollow answered back. The sound behind the stone did not belong in an empty house. Ethan froze beside the fireplace, flashlight trembling faintly in his hand, while Atlas scratched again at the wall with growing urgency. Dust drifted down from the old mortar. Somewhere deep behind the rock came a hollow echo, low and distant, like a hidden space breathing for the first time in years. The cold inside the cave house suddenly felt heavier. Older. Ethan stepped closer. The stone around the fireplace looked uneven now that he studied it carefully. One section, near the floor, carried thinner layers of mortar, darker than the surrounding rock, as though somebody had sealed it in a hurry long ago. Atlas pressed his nose against the cracks and released a soft whine from deep in his throat. Ethan had heard that sound before. During search operations, missing persons, disaster scenes. It was the sound Atlas made when human scent lingered where it should not. "You found something, boy?" Atlas scratched harder. The old wall answered with another empty knock beneath the stone. Ethan set down the flashlight and crouched beside the fireplace. His fingers brushed across the cold surface until they caught against something metal hidden beneath dirt and soot. A rusted iron ring, barely visible, buried into the rock itself. Ethan frowned. "What were you hiding in here?" He wrapped both hands around the ring and pulled. At first nothing happened. Then, with a deep grinding groan that echoed through the cave house, part of the stone wall shifted inward several inches. Dust exploded into the air. Atlas stepped back instantly, ears alert, body tense. A narrow opening appeared behind the fireplace. Black as midnight. Ethan stared silently into the darkness. The smell that drifted out carried damp earth, old cedar, and something strangely familiar beneath it all. Tobacco smoke. Ancient but preserved by stone and cold air. He swallowed hard. Somebody built this place to keep secrets. The flashlight beam cut into the hidden passage. Stone steps descended beneath the house, disappearing underground. Water dripped steadily below. Tick, tick, tick. Atlas moved first, careful and slow. Ethan followed behind him, boots scraping against uneven rock while shadows stretched along the narrow walls. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. 20 feet down, the staircase opened into a hidden chamber carved directly into the mountain. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. Shelves lined the walls. Old lanterns, mining tools, dust-covered crates stacked waist-high. A wooden table collapsed in one corner beneath yellowed newspapers dated October 1968. The room looked untouched by time. Atlas walked toward the far wall and sat down beside a small iron chest coated in rust. His amber eyes lifted toward Ethan quietly, patiently, as if he already understood this place mattered. Ethan approached slowly. The lock on the chest had long since corroded apart. He lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay a folded American flag wrapped around several objects preserved in oilcloth. His chest tightened immediately. A pair of Marine Corps dog tags rested on top, beside an old sheriff badge tarnished nearly black with age. Beneath them sat a photograph. Ethan picked it up gently. 3 people stood smiling outside the same cave house decades earlier. A young woman with auburn hair, a little girl missing her front tooth, and a broad-shouldered deputy wearing a sheriff uniform and a familiar expression Ethan recognized instantly. The kind worn by tired men trying to protect something fragile in a hard world. Atlas lowered his head suddenly and stared toward the back corner of the chamber. Ethan turned the flashlight slowly. More footprints covered the dust there. Fresh ones. Not old. Not decades old. Recent. Very recent. Then, from somewhere above them inside the cave house, floorboards creaked softly. The sound above lasted only a second, but it was enough. Atlas rose instantly from beside the iron chest, muscles tight beneath his sable coat, while a low warning growl rolled through the underground chamber. Ethan shut the chest quietly and killed the flashlight beam for a moment. Darkness swallowed them whole. The cave air smelled damp and cold, layered with old cedar, dust, and the faint scent of rain drifting down from cracks in the stone ceiling. Then came another creak overhead. Slow footsteps. Somebody was inside the house. Ethan's pulse sharpened. He had spent too many years working patrol shifts not to recognize the difference between an old house settling and the careful weight of human movement. Atlas stared upward toward the hidden staircase, ears rigid. Ethan rested one hand against the dog's shoulder. "Easy," he whispered. The German shepherd stayed silent, but his body remained coiled like a spring. Ethan reached into the chest once more and slipped the sheriff badge into his jacket pocket along with the photograph. Something about the faces in that picture unsettled him. Not fear exactly. Familiarity. Especially the deputy. Ethan could not explain why, but the man's eyes reminded him of someone he had known years ago. Somebody honest. Somebody tired. Another floorboard groaned above them. Closer this time. Ethan slowly backed toward the staircase with Atlas leading ahead. The narrow steps echoed faintly beneath their boots as they climbed. The hidden stone panel remained half open beside the fireplace upstairs, allowing a pale ribbon of moonlight to spill through the gap. Ethan paused halfway up. Through the opening, he could see movement crossing the living room. A flashlight beam, thin and white. Whoever it was moved slowly through the cave house, careful not to make noise. Atlas released the faintest rumble from his chest. Ethan crouched lower beside him. Then a man's voice drifted softly through the darkness above. "I know somebody's here." The voice sounded older, calm, not threatening. Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Atlas before pushing the stone panel wider. Dust scraped across rock as he stepped back into the living room. A tall older man stood near the front window holding a lantern in one hand and a flashlight in the other. He looked to be in his late 60s with weathered skin, silver hair tucked beneath a faded ranch cap, and heavy shoulders bent slightly by time. A thick canvas coat hung over flannel layers that smelled faintly of wood smoke and horses. The old man's eyes narrowed immediately when he saw Ethan emerge from behind the fireplace. Then his gaze dropped toward Atlas. "Well," he murmured quietly. "Guess the stories were true after all." Ethan stayed still. "Who are you?" The man lowered the flashlight. "Name is Walter Grady. I own the gas station down the road." He glanced toward the hidden chamber entrance now exposed behind the fireplace. The color slowly drained from his face. "Lord help me," he whispered. "You opened it." Rain tapped softly against the boarded windows while silence stretched through the cave house. Walter stepped closer, moving carefully like a man approaching a grave. "That room was sealed in 1971, he said. "Folks around Black Hollow made sure nobody touched it again." Ethan folded his arms slowly. "Why?" Walter looked toward the fire-blackened stone wall. His eyes carried the weight of old memories buried too long. "Because Sheriff Daniel Mercer disappeared in this house 55 years ago," he said softly. "And after he vanished, people around here stopped asking questions." Atlas suddenly turned toward the front porch and barked once. Sharp. Immediate. Headlights flashed briefly through the fog outside the windows. Another vehicle had just pulled up beside the cave house. The headlights outside lingered in the fog like pale ghosts pressing against the mountain. Atlas stood rigid near the front door, ears high, amber eyes fixed on the glow moving beyond the rain-streaked windows. Walter Grady muttered something under his breath and tightened his grip around the lantern handle. "That is not good," he whispered. Ethan stepped carefully toward the porch. Every floorboard beneath his boots groaned with age. Outside, a black Cadillac Escalade sat idling beside the cliff road, polished and expensive against the mud and pine shadows surrounding the cave house. The engine hummed softly beneath the rain. A man stepped out slowly, adjusting the collar of a dark wool coat before shutting the door behind him. Even from the porch, Ethan could tell the stranger carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. Tall, broad, clean-shaven, silver hair swept neatly back despite the storm. The kind of man who looked out of place anywhere dirt touched his shoes. Walter's face hardened immediately. "Harold Bennett," he said quietly, "owns half this county." The man climbed the porch steps without hurry, his leather shoes tapping softly against wet wood. When he reached the doorway, his blue eyes landed first on Ethan, then Atlas, then the partially open stone passage behind the fireplace. For the briefest second, something cold flickered across his expression. Fear. But it vanished almost instantly beneath a practiced smile. "Evening," Bennett said smoothly. His voice carried the polished calm of courtroom speeches and charity dinners. "I heard somebody finally bought this old ruin." Ethan crossed his arms. "You tracking real estate purchases at midnight now?" Bennett smiled faintly. "Small town. News travels." Rain rolled off the porch roof behind him, while thunder murmured somewhere beyond the mountains. Atlas did not bark. He simply stared at the man without blinking. Walter stepped beside Ethan slowly. "What are you doing here, Harold?" Bennett glanced toward the older man with mild annoyance. "Same thing you are, Walter." Curiosity. His eyes shifted again toward the hidden chamber entrance. "Although I must admit, I did not expect anyone to open that wall." Silence settled heavily across the room. Ethan noticed Bennett's hands then. Perfectly steady. Too steady. Most people would have looked surprised seeing a secret room hidden inside a mountain house. Bennett looked prepared. "You knew about it," Ethan said quietly. Bennett tilted his head slightly. "Everybody in Black Hollow knows the stories. Not everybody drives up here in the middle of a rainstorm after 50 years. For the first time, Bennett's smile weakened. Just slightly. Atlas stepped forward beside Ethan and released a low growl that vibrated through the cave house like distant thunder. Bennett's eyes dropped toward the German shepherd. "Beautiful dog," he murmured. "Smart too, I imagine." Ethan rested one hand gently against Atlas's neck. "Smarter than most people." Bennett nodded slowly, then removed a pair of leather gloves with deliberate calm. "Listen carefully, Mr. Walker. This property carries a great deal of unfortunate history. People around here prefer leaving old wounds buried." Walter scoffed softly. "You mean buried like Sheriff Mercer?" Bennett ignored him completely. "I am willing to buy the property from you tonight. Cash." Ethan almost laughed. "You do not even know what I paid for it." $400, Bennett replied instantly. The room fell silent again. Rain hammered harder against the windows now. Walter stared openly at Bennett while Ethan's jaw tightened. "How generous," Ethan said quietly. "What are you offering?" Bennett reached inside his coat and removed a folded checkbook. $50,000. Tonight. No paperwork delays. No questions. Atlas suddenly barked once. Loud. Sharp. Immediate. Ethan looked down. The dog's gaze remained fixed on Bennett's right coat pocket. His nose twitched once. Then again. Ethan knew that look. Atlas had found a scent before the dog himself even understood why it mattered. Tobacco smoke. Old cedar. The same scent drifting from the hidden chamber below. The smell hit Ethan a second before the memory did. Tobacco. Cedar oil. Old leather. Atlas stood motionless in front of Harold Bennett now, nose lifted toward the man's coat pocket while rain whispered against the cave house windows behind them. Ethan's stomach tightened slowly. He had smelled that same combination inside the hidden chamber beneath the fireplace. The same scent clung to the folded flag. The iron chest. The old photograph sealed underground for half a century. Bennett noticed the shift in Ethan's expression immediately. "Your dog seems uneasy," he said calmly. Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he watched Atlas carefully. German shepherds did not care about money. They did not care about reputation or polished smiles or expensive cars parked outside mountain houses. Dogs cared about instinct. Truth. The things human beings spent entire lives learning to ignore. Atlas stepped forward another inch. One low growl vibrated through his chest. Walter swallowed hard beside the doorway. "Harold," the older man murmured quietly, "what exactly are you doing up here?" Bennett slid the checkbook back into his coat with slow, controlled movements. "Trying to prevent unnecessary trouble." Ethan folded his arms. "Funny thing about trouble," he said softly, "usually shows up when people start offering 50 grand to buy silence." The room cooled further as wind slipped through cracks in the old stone walls. Somewhere deeper in the cave house, water dripped steadily through the mountain. Tick, tick, tick. Bennett's polished expression weakened for the first time. Barely noticeable, but Ethan saw it. Years of police work had taught him where fear lived in a person's face. Around the eyes, in the jaw, in the tiny pauses between breaths. Bennett glanced once toward the hidden chamber entrance behind the fireplace. Too quickly. "You do not understand what you found down there," he said quietly. "Then explain it." Bennett exhaled through his nose and stared out the rain-covered window toward the cliffs. 55 years ago this town nearly collapsed, he said. The mines were closing. Families were leaving. Sheriff Mercer started making accusations against powerful people in Black Hollow. Men who owned land. Businesses. Banks. Walter's face darkened. Mercer was investigating missing money, he said quietly. County funds. Relief programs. Bennett ignored him. People grew paranoid. Angry. Then one night the sheriff disappeared. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket slowly and removed the old photograph from the hidden chamber. He held it toward Bennett beneath the lantern glow. Who was the little girl? Bennett stared at the picture without speaking. Rain rolled harder outside now, tapping against the porch roof like restless fingers. Atlas remained perfectly still beside Ethan, watching the older man with unblinking eyes. Finally Bennett spoke. Her name was Clara. His voice had changed. Softer now. Older somehow. Sheriff Mercer's daughter. Ethan glanced down at the smiling child frozen forever inside the faded photograph. Missing front tooth. Freckles. Tiny hand clutching the sheriff's arm. What happened to her? Bennett looked away. She disappeared after her father did. Silence swallowed the room. Walter removed his cap slowly. People said she ran away. People say lots of things, Bennett replied sharply. Atlas suddenly moved. Fast. The German shepherd stepped directly toward Bennett and pressed his nose against the man's coat pocket before Ethan could stop him. Bennett jerked backward instinctively. A small object slipped free from the coat and hit the wooden floor with a metallic clink. Everyone froze. Ethan bent down slowly and picked it up beneath the lantern light. A silver lighter, tarnished with age, engraved initials across the front. DM. Walter's face went pale immediately. "Dear God," he whispered. Ethan looked up slowly at Harold Bennett. "You were there." Bennett's shoulders sagged slightly beneath the weight of something he had clearly carried for decades. Outside, thunder rolled low across the mountains while Atlas stood silent between them all, like the only soul in the room incapable of lying. The old silver lighter rested heavily in Ethan's palm while rain rolled down the cave house windows in silver rivers. DM. The engraved initials caught the lantern glow with a dull shine softened by decades of wear. Sheriff Daniel Mercer had held this lighter once, carried it, used it, and somehow it ended up inside Harold Bennett's coat pocket 55 years after the sheriff vanished into silence. Nobody in the room spoke for several seconds. Atlas remained beside Ethan, broad chest rising slowly, amber eyes fixed on Bennett like a soldier guarding a confession. The wealthy man stared at the lighter with something deeper than fear now. Regret. Ethan recognized that too. He had seen it on faces outside hospital rooms and courthouse doors. The look people wore when memory finally stopped letting them sleep. Walter Grady lowered himself into an old wooden chair near the fireplace as though his legs no longer trusted him. "Harold," he whispered quietly, "tell the truth for once in your life." Bennett rubbed one hand across his jaw before looking toward the hidden chamber beneath the fireplace. "Daniel Mercer was my friend," he said at last. His voice sounded older now, stripped clean of polish. "Before the money, before the land deals, before all of this." Thunder rolled softly across the mountains beyond the cave walls. Ethan listened without moving. Bennett walked slowly toward the rain-streaked window. Back then Black Hollow was dying. Mines closing. Families starving. The county-approved federal relief money meant to keep people alive through the winter. He paused, but some of the town leaders started stealing from it. Walter shut his eyes painfully. "We all knew rumors. Daniel had proof," Bennett continued. "Documents. Names. Bank transfers." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So they silenced him?" Bennett shook his head slowly. "No. Daniel planned to expose everything publicly. But he hid the evidence first. Said if anything happened to him, the truth would survive." The wind moaned softly through cracks in the cave house roof. Atlas moved closer beside Ethan as if sensing the weight growing inside the room. "What happened that night?" Ethan asked quietly. Bennett swallowed hard. "I came here to warn him. I was young, scared. I told him powerful men would destroy him if he kept digging." He stared down at the lighter in Ethan's hand. "We argued. Daniel refused to back down." Walter leaned forward slowly. And then, Bennett's eyes darkened with old grief. A truck came up the mountain after midnight. 3 men, county officials, wealthy investors, men who believed money mattered more than people. He exhaled shakily. Daniel hid Clara in the underground chamber before they arrived. Ethan looked sharply toward the hidden staircase beneath the fireplace. "She was here that night?" Bennett nodded once. "Just 8 years old." Rain hammered the roof harder now while the lantern flame flickered against the stone walls. "Daniel handed me the lighter and told me to get Clara out through the old mining path behind the cliff." His voice cracked slightly, but she heard everything upstairs. "She ran before I could stop her." Silence swallowed the room again. Ethan felt the weight of the photograph inside his jacket pocket like a stone pressing against his ribs. "Nobody ever found her," Walter whispered. Bennett stared into the storm beyond the window. "Because nobody kept looking." Atlas suddenly lifted his head toward the hidden chamber again. His ears twitched sharply. Ethan noticed it instantly. "What is it, boy?" The German shepherd walked toward the staircase and stopped beside the stone wall. Then he barked once. Sharp. Urgent. Ethan grabbed the lantern and followed him underground. The chamber looked unchanged at first glance. Dust. Crates. Cold stone. But Atlas stood beside the far wall now, nose pressed low near the floor where an old wool blanket partially covered the rock. Ethan pulled the blanket aside carefully. Beneath it lay a narrow wooden door built directly into the mountain wall, small enough for a child to crawl through. The small wooden door looked impossibly fragile against the cold stone wall, barely 3 feet high, and hidden so carefully beneath the wool blanket that nobody could have found it without Atlas. The German shepherd stood beside it silently, tail low, ears forward, watching Ethan with the same focused patience he once carried during search operations. Ethan knelt slowly and brushed years of dust from the tiny rusted handle. The wood smelled old, dry, preserved by the mountain itself. Walter descended the staircase behind him carrying the lantern, while Harold Bennett followed more slowly, his face pale beneath the trembling glow. Nobody spoke. The cave chamber had become something sacred now, a tomb for truths too heavy to bury forever. Ethan pulled gently on the handle. At first the little door refused to move. Then, with a soft cracking sound, it opened inward just enough for cold air to breathe out from the darkness beyond. Atlas immediately lowered his head and slipped through the opening before Ethan could stop him. "Atlas," Ethan whispered sharply. But the dog was already moving deeper into the narrow passage hidden inside the mountain wall. Ethan grabbed the lantern and followed on his hands and knees through the cramped tunnel. The stone scraped against his jacket shoulders while damp earth pressed cold beneath his palms. The air smelled untouched, frozen in time. Somewhere ahead, Atlas whined softly, not alarmed, sad. The tunnel widened suddenly into a small, natural chamber carved deep inside the cliff itself. Ethan stopped breathing. The lantern light flickered across a tiny hidden room no larger than a tool shed. An old cot rested against one wall beneath moth-eaten blankets. Empty soup cans sat neatly stacked beside a lantern burned black with soot. A child's drawing still hung from the rock wall by a rusted nail. Crude mountains beneath a yellow crayon sun. 3 stick figures holding hands beside a dog. Walter crawled into the chamber behind Ethan and covered his mouth silently. Harold Bennett remained frozen near the tunnel entrance, unable to step farther inside. Ethan's eyes moved slowly across the room. Somebody had lived here once. Hidden, waiting, surviving. Atlas stood beside the cot now, nose pressed gently against a faded blue backpack resting on the floorboards. The fabric looked ancient but carefully preserved from moisture beneath layers of oilcloth. Ethan knelt beside it carefully. His fingers shook slightly as he unzipped the bag. Inside rested a stack of notebooks tied together with faded red ribbon. Beneath them sat another photograph. Ethan lifted it slowly toward the lantern light. An older Clara Mercer smiled back at him. 15 or 16 maybe. Freckles still visible across her cheeks. Auburn hair longer now. Beside her stood a German shepherd with dark sable fur and sharp amber eyes nearly identical to Atlas. Ethan swallowed hard. "She survived," he whispered. Harold Bennett finally stepped into the chamber, his breathing uneven. The moment he saw the photograph, something inside him seemed to collapse quietly. He lowered himself onto the stone floor with trembling hands covering his face. "Oh God," he whispered brokenly. "Clara." Walter stared at the old notebooks inside the backpack. "What are those?" Ethan untied the ribbon carefully and opened the first notebook beneath the lantern glow. The handwriting inside looked shaky at first, childlike, then steadier as the pages continued. Dates stretched across years. Ethan read silently for several seconds before his chest tightened. "It is her journal," he said quietly. Rain murmured faintly above the mountain while the lantern crackled softly in the hidden chamber. Atlas rested beside the cot now, head lowered across his paws like a guardian finally bringing someone home. Ethan turned another page slowly, then another. The deeper he read, the colder his expression became. Clara Mercer had not only survived. She had written down every name involved in stealing from Black Hollow. Every secret, every lie, including one name repeated again and again throughout the journal. Harold Bennett. The lantern flame trembled softly inside the hidden chamber while Ethan turned page after page beneath the mountain stone. Clara Mercer's handwriting changed over the years like a person growing older in isolation. The early pages carried uneven letters and childish fear. Later entries became sharper, more deliberate, smarter. Atlas rested beside the cot without moving, his amber eyes reflecting the flickering lantern glow while rain continued whispering over the cliffs above them. Ethan read silently, jaw tightening with every page. Clara had survived hidden inside the mountain for nearly 3 years after her father vanished. Sheriff Mercer had prepared the chamber long before that night, fearing what powerful men in Black Hollow might do once his investigation reached the wrong people. Supplies, water access through underground springs, emergency exits through the old mining tunnels beneath the cliffs. The sheriff had hidden his daughter inside the mountain because he believed the truth mattered more than his own safety. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He understood men like that. Men who sacrificed everything trying to hold a broken world together. Walter stood silently beside him, weathered hands trembling around the lantern handle. Harold Bennett remained seated against the stone wall, staring toward the floor like a man slowly drowning beneath memories too heavy to carry anymore. She wrote everything down, Ethan said quietly. The missing county funds, the fake land deals, relief money stolen from struggling families. He looked up slowly toward Bennett. And she wrote your name more than anybody else's. Bennett shut his eyes. I know. The mountain chamber fell silent except for dripping water somewhere deep in the rock. Atlas lifted his head slightly, watching Bennett carefully. Ethan opened another journal near the back of the stack. The pages there looked newer somehow. Cleaner. Clara's handwriting steadier. Older. He began reading aloud quietly beneath the lantern glow. Harold came back tonight. He cried when he saw me. Said he never stopped searching. Said he was too weak back then to stop the others. Bennett covered his face with one shaking hand. Ethan continued reading. He brings food now. Medicine. Blankets in winter. He says the town believes I died long ago, and maybe that is safer. Walter looked stunned. You knew she was alive? Bennett nodded slowly without lifting his head. For years. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. Then why leave her hidden down here? Bennett's voice cracked softly. Because she begged me to. Silence swallowed the chamber again. The lantern hissed faintly while Atlas shifted closer beside Ethan. Bennett finally looked up, eyes wet beneath the flickering light. Clara hated this town after what happened to her father. She trusted nobody. Not the sheriff's department. Not the courts. Not the people. He swallowed hard. She believed if the truth surfaced too soon, the wrong men would bury it again. Ethan turned another page carefully. Near the end of the journal, the handwriting weakened. Smaller now. Slower. My lungs hurt more every winter, Clara had written. But Atlas keeps me company. Ethan froze slightly. His eyes moved lower across the page. Not this Atlas. Another shepherd. Same bloodline. Harold says German shepherds remember sorrow differently than people do. They stay beside it until the hurting stops. Ethan glanced instinctively toward the dog resting beside him. Atlas met his gaze calmly, as though somehow connected to the mountain's buried grief long before either of them arrived here. Walter wiped at his eyes roughly. What happened to her? Bennett reached slowly into his coat pocket and removed a folded letter yellowed with age. His fingers trembled as he handed it toward Ethan. She gave me that 12 years ago. Ethan unfolded the paper carefully. Clara's handwriting covered the page in faded ink. If anyone honest ever finds this place, the letter read, Tell them my father was a good man. Tell them he tried to protect people when others chose money instead. And tell whoever finds this house not to let it die empty. Let it shelter something good. Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. The room smelled of cedar smoke, wet stone, and old sorrow finally reaching daylight after half a century underground. Bennett stared toward the child's drawing hanging on the rock wall. Clara died during the winter storm of 2014, he whispered softly. Peacefully. I buried her beneath the pine ridge overlooking the lake because she said she wanted to hear the wind one last time. No one spoke after that. Even the storm above the mountain seemed quieter now. Atlas rose slowly from beside the cot and walked toward Harold Bennett. The old man stiffened as the German shepherd approached. Then Atlas rested his head gently against Bennett's knee. And for the first time in decades, Harold Bennett finally began to cry. Morning arrived slowly over Black Hollow, spilling pale gold across the mountains and melting the storm clouds into ribbons of silver mist drifting through the pine trees. The cave house looked different in daylight. Less haunted. The broken porch still leaned toward the ravine. Moss still clung to the stone walls. But something inside the mountain no longer felt buried. Ethan stood outside beneath the cold morning air holding Clara Mercer's journals against his chest, while Atlas rested beside him near the porch steps. The German shepherd watched the sun rise quietly, ears twitching each time the wind moved through the forest. Somewhere down near the valley, Church bells rang faintly through the morning fog. Walter Grady loaded supplies back into his old pickup, while Harold Bennett remained seated alone near the edge of the cliff overlooking the lake below. He had not spoken much since dawn. Age seemed heavier on him now somehow. Smaller. The kind of exhaustion money could never cure. Ethan walked slowly toward him, boots crunching across wet gravel. Atlas followed close behind. Bennett looked out across the mountains without lifting his head. "I spent 50 years trying to outrun that night," he said quietly. "Turns out guilt travels lighter than truth. It never gets tired." Ethan sat beside him on the weathered bench overlooking the valley. Cold wind carried the scent of pine and rain-soaked earth through the morning air. "You could have destroyed the journals," Ethan said. Bennett nodded faintly. "Many times." His eyes drifted toward Atlas. "But Clara trusted dogs more than people. Said they stayed loyal even after the world gave them reasons not to." Atlas rested his head gently against Ethan's knee while silence settled peacefully between them. Down below the cliffs, Black Hollow slowly woke beneath the morning light. Smoke rose from chimneys. Trucks rolled along distant roads. Tiny, ordinary lives continuing without knowing the mountain above them had spent decades holding somebody's sorrow in secret. Ethan looked down at Clara's final letter again. "Let it shelter something good." The words lingered inside him long after the storm had passed. 3 months later, the cave house no longer stood abandoned. Fresh cedar beams replaced the broken porch. New windows reflected sunlight across the cliffs where darkness once lived. The hidden chamber beneath the mountain remained untouched except for a single lantern Ethan kept burning there every evening beside Clara's journals and Sheriff Mercer's photograph. People from Black Hollow began climbing the mountain road again, slowly at first. Veterans struggling to sleep through the night. Travelers passing through town. Men carrying grief too heavy for ordinary places. Ethan opened the house to all of them. No payment. No questions. Just coffee, warmth, and silence when silence was needed. Atlas became the soul of the place. He greeted every stranger at the porch before they even knocked. Some nights, he would rest beside veterans, shaking through old memories until sunrise touched the windows. Other nights, he simply sat beside the fireplace, listening while lonely people spoke truths they had buried for years. Somehow the dog always seemed to know which kind of comfort mattered more. Walter often brought supplies from town, while Harold Bennett quietly funded repairs without asking for recognition. One cold November morning, he placed a bronze plaque beside the front gate before driving away without a word. Ethan found it later beneath fresh snowfall. In memory of Sheriff Daniel Mercer and Clara Mercer. Truth survives where kindness remains. Years passed quietly after that. The mountain stayed peaceful. The storms still came every winter. Wind still moved through the pines above the cliffs exactly the same way it had 50 years earlier. But the cave house no longer carried fear. Only grace. One evening near sunset, Ethan stood alone on the porch watching amber light spill across the valley while Atlas rested beside him, older now, gray beginning to touch the fur around his muzzle. The German shepherd looked up slowly as church bells drifted through the cold mountain air once more. Ethan smiled faintly and rested one hand against the dog's neck. "You found it, buddy," he whispered softly. "Not the secret. The reason." Atlas leaned gently into him while the last sunlight touched the stone walls of the old mountain house. And somewhere deep inside the quiet, it finally felt like all the lost souls there had made it home.